Good evening, everyone. If you would like, well, looky there, we have somebody from way out west with us. Hey, stranger. Good to see you. All right, if you will, got me all distracted there. Look in 1 Kings. We are in 1 Kings chapter 6. 1 Kings chapter 6. And the time has arrived for Solomon to do the task in which he had been commissioned to do by the Lord, and which his father David had prepared for. So in chapter 6 and verse 1, it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is in the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. And we're looking somewhere around 966 BC when this building project would take place. So 4 years into his reign, and I suppose that it took that long probably to just get this actually going, even though a lot of preparation had been made for years before. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to try to read every detail of the temple. We're going to try to give a description of the temple here. And I think that the Holy Spirit gives us the details that are given to give us some concept of how grand this house for the Lord would be. And you remember that David made the point that this has to be a special place. Why? It's for Yahweh. It's for the true and living God. And so it needs to be spectacular. And so that's what we're seeing here. So we've got this artist rendition here, and of course, depending on which illustration you look at, you're going to see some variations, because the details that are given here are not given in such a way for a recreation. They're given in a way for us to understand some things, but if you try to recreate it, there's somebody saying like, well, how did this fit together? Well, exactly what did that look like? And we don't know. Those details are not always given. But we can have a pretty good idea of how spectacular this would be. For instance, the dimensions that are given in verse 2. It says its length was 60 cubits and its width 20 and its height 30 cubits. In other words, it was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. And so I don't know that this little man is to scale here, but you get some idea of this building. It's interesting that in the ancient world, there were not just huge buildings. A lot of the buildings were not that gigantic in scale. What is going to be impressive about the temple is not, wow, we've never seen a building this big before. What's going to be impressive about the temple is its construction. And you don't have to have a real big building for it to be really impressive when it's completely lined with gold. And so we're not looking at a massive structure, but we are given the dimensions here. And then it had a porch on it in verse 3, a vestibule that was 30 feet wide and 15 feet long. That was on the front part of it here. And so we'll just go through and kind of look at these different sections and talk about it just a little bit, and then see if there's some questions maybe that need to be answered as we go along through here.
But one thing, what you just mentioned about all the inside of it did go. And when they built it, I would prefer, as from drawing and working on Alabama limestone stuff, the gold and all was probably installed after the structure was up. And then the world, the only way that they could even have an idea that it had gold in it would have to be some of the priests or the workers installing the gold to even tell anybody about it. All the nations would see it was this grandeur size limestone building, but they would have no idea that it had over $1 billion worth of gold inside it, covering everything. But it would be a grand building if somebody went by Jerusalem and said, wow, what is that they're building on the hill?
Yeah. Yep. So you look at verse 5, and it said it had chambers around it, around the walls of the temple, and 3 stories of chambers on the side. And it's kind of interesting, the dimensions of these chambers are not all the same. You would expect if you've got, a 3-story building here, that your floor space on each story, each floor would be the same. but that's not the case here. So some dimensions are given here where you see how the wall has offsets in it for the floor beams of the above story to rest upon. And the reason that's given here is because they didn't want any of the beams fastened into the wall. Now, I don't know if that was the idea of a purification thing or a structural integrity thing, but they wanted the floor beams, the floor joists to be resting on the offsets of the wall itself. So the bottom story is going to be a little bit narrower than the middle, and that's going to be a little bit narrower than the top story there. And these storehouses, or these chambers, are for storing the supplies of the offerings that would be given, that would also be given to the priest, and so forth on that. So we're given some information there about these storage chambers.
What you just described, from what we read earlier, when God actually gave David the information and Solomon through divine how to build all this and what he wanted to do, this was designed by God.
Right.
And even though as humans that they didn't understand what was going on, they knew, just like Noah did, you build it by the plan. If you don't build it by God's plan, it ain't going to work.
Yep. So one thing that's interesting about the construction of this, it was a stone structure, but it's going to be lined with wood and with other precious metals. But the stones that were used in this were quarried at other places and finished at other places, so that there would not be any sound of a tool there. In other words, this seemed to be a sacred spot, and therefore noise pollution was not allowed. I don't know the best way to word this, but so the stones were finished somewhere else, which adds to the craftsmanship of this a lot. I was talking to somebody the other day about installing crown molding, and how frustrating that was, because I would cut it over here, and when I got it up there, it wasn't like it was supposed to be. And what I found is it was better to just put it up and repair it there. In other words, when I say repair, caulk mostly.
That's what they make caulk.
That's what they make caulk for. And so your craftsmanship doesn't have to be quite as precise if you can kind of make it work. You can alter it on site. But that's not what's happening here. And so the craftsmanship is extraordinary in the fact that they are cutting these stones, finishing these stones somewhere else, and then moving them there, and they fit. They fit perfectly. And so we get some indication of just the care that was put into this and the skill that was put into this. After all, this is a house for the Lord, and therefore this type of craftsmanship is needed.
I'll give you a little insight. If you ever do need crown molding, you need to get in touch with Linda Graham. She worked at Franklin Homes and was running 7-8 houses a day. She'd go in there and just see if it had a 45 or a 90, and then she'd measure between the walls. She'd take a whole skid of crown. She didn't recut it. She just sat there and nailed it all up. If the craftsman is smart in their field, it ain't no patching. You just run with it, shoot it up, be done. I've seen her work for years.
Verse 9. So he built the temple and finished it, and paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. Okay, so you have the main structure made of stone. But then you have all of the interior walls paneled and lined with cedar. And the floors are going to be lined with cypress as well. So if you're looking on the inside, you're not seeing stone walls. What you're seeing is wood paneling all on the inside. And then this wood paneling is going to have intricate engravings and detail work carved into it. And then that will be overlaid with gold. So if you were on the inside, it would look like, well, it wouldn't even look like a wood building. It would look like a gold building if you were standing from the inside. If you were standing on the outside, it would look like a stone structure that would be there. You got anything you want to add through verse 10?
Yeah, I don't know if you deliberately skip verse 8 talking about the entrance to those storage
Yeah.
facilities was on the south side, and it had stairs going up to each floor.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be laid out just like the tabernacle. You remember, it was the front door would be facing east. So this would be laid out that same way. So when it gives directions like that, south, north, east, you kind of know how everything's laid out. But the windows in it also would be above those storage, the side storage units, and they would, like you see right there, and they would be recessed to the inside. I think that allowed for better lighting and whatnot. But
You want to take the most holy place, 16.
yeah, okay. Verse 16. He built 20 cubits of the rear of the house with boards of cedar from the floor to the walls, and he built this within as a inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. The house that is the nave in front of the inner sanctuary, or the holy place, was 40 cubits long. The cedar within the house was carved in the forms of gourds. You might, King James say, have a different.
Yeah, in verse 18, it says ornamental buds, open flowers.
So that gives us a completely different picture from what I think of gourds. Let's see, open flowers, all was cedar, no stone was seen, so all the stone was covered in planks, and then the wood would be covered as well. What would the wood be covered in? Gold. So, trying to really picture this is difficult, but, I don't think it's, like Ronnie said, I don't think it's critical that we, understand the details to an exact science, but just appreciate what's taken place here, the detail that's being, and the expense. I don't know how you would even try to come up with a price tag on this.
Yeah.
Verse 19, the inner sanctuary he prepared with the innermost part of the house to set the ark of the covenant of the Lord. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, so it was a perfect cube, is what the most holy place was. 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. It makes mention Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. He drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. He overlaid the house with gold until the house was finished. Also the whole altar. Verses 23 through 28 describe the cherubim that were erected in there. And
what does a cherubim look like?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're not exactly sure. And we know they had wings. We got that. Some would say that a cherubim was an ox-like figure. In Ezekiel, it describes, in one place, it describes the cherubim as having a face, 4 faces, and one of those would be an ox. In another place, it describes them having 4 faces, and in place of the face of an ox, it says in the face of a cherubim. So some would say, oh, it's an oxen. But then that doesn't always fit all the other descriptions that we have as well. So you'll see that in this, they have some type of four-legged creature there, but you'll see other illustrations where it's an upright figure, and so we don't know. So those are the type details that it's like, okay, we're not sure exactly what that looked like.
They would be facing east with their wings outspread to where one wing would be touching the wall, the other wing would be touching the other cherub's wing in the middle, and then the other cherub would be identical, and the ark would be laid underneath their wings in the middle of that room. They would be 15 foot tall.
Yeah, that's pretty tall.
That's pretty tall.
Yeah, and so you got a 30-foot room, and you got these going up halfway up to the ceiling.
And they were all overlaid with gold as well. And of course, in verse 29 and 30, it describes all these engravings. Everything was engraved in cherubim, palm trees, open flowers. The inner outer rooms were engraved in this way. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold, in the inner and outer rooms. And so, it's hard to imagine the detail that has been put into this, but it's pretty extravagant.
Yeah, the inside would have been incredibly impressive, I would think. And much like the tabernacle, how was this lit? Lamps. Now, this has windows as well, so maybe there would be times where the sun would be shining in, but can you imagine what even the lamps would look like reflecting off of this gold that was on the floor everywhere, everywhere, and lighting up these figures that are carved on the walls? It would be very inspiring, very awe-inspiring. And that was the idea. This has to be an incredible building because it's for Yahweh. That was the thought process behind it. And that's the reason this detail is being placed in it.
Verses 31 and 32 describe the doors, the entrance into the most holy place, which would also be facing east. They were made of olive wood. Describes the doorpost being 5-sided. That's interesting. Covered the doors with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, open flowers, and of course they were overlaid with gold. So these carvings were carved into the wood and then overlaid in gold. I don't know if they were fashioned, if they were hammered in, how that exactly took place, but
yeah, I don't know either. So that's what the inside looked like. Now we're going to get a little bit of detail here. I want us to skip down to chapter 7. And you got anything else you want to say through chapter 6?
No.
Okay. We will notice that in verse 38, the last sentence there, how long does it take him to build this? 7 years. 7 years. And so a lot of details going into this, a lot of work's going into this. Drop all the way down to chapter 7. We're going to come back and cover the first 12 to 14 verses later. But I wanted to drop down to verse 15 and notice on the outside you have 2 pillars of bronze. And these pillars were 27 feet high, 18 foot in circumference, and had a 7.5 foot capital top part sitting on top of them. And so you got a total height of 35 feet. And these would be on the front. What are they made of? Bronze. Were they solid bronze? No, they were hollowed out. They were hollowed out. As a matter of fact, they were cast, and which was a pretty difficult process in ancient times. And they were cast down in the Jordan Valley. If you can envision a map, I don't have a map up here, but this is being built in Jerusalem. But the pillars are cast in the clay in the Jordan Valley. Anybody remember the trail that goes from the Jordan Valley near Jericho up to Jerusalem? Anybody remember any photos of what that looks like? It's pretty mountainous. Yes, it is. When I made that trip in a little car that I rented that was terribly underpowered, I really wondered if we were going to be able to get up it. I was telling somebody this morning that Spruce Pine Mountain is nothing, and it's like 5 miles of that type of terrain, just as steep as you can imagine. And they're taking this cast pillar and somehow transporting that up to Jerusalem. Huge feat being undertaken in that. And so the whole process from the casting of an object this large in ancient times to moving it and being able to transport it into place, erecting it where it's supposed to go, then setting the capital that is supposed to be on top of it. And by the way, the capital is described here, made of a lattice network of wreaths and chain works, and it says there were chains on it, some type of linked detailing on it. 2 rows of pomegranates, a network around to cover it. Seems like there was maybe some other lilies, 4 cubits, and it had some type of bulb shape or looked like a flower that was opening up on the top. And there were 2 of these placed on each side of the doorway, and they named them. What did they name them? Yeah, Jachin and Boaz. What does Jachin mean? Okay, yes, or he establishes. It can be translated a different way. And Boaz? Yes, it's strength. So the idea, I think, is that God's promise to establish and His power to strengthen is what upholds God's people. So God's promise and His power to complete His promise is what makes Israel a nation. It's what their hope rests upon. And so when they're building this object to God, this temple for God to dwell, they're thinking about, God, we're trusting in your ability to establish your promises and to carry them out by your power. And so they're resting upon that. And so it's interesting because we get to the New Testament and it says that what is the pillar and ground of the truth?
Jesus.
That's a good answer. That's not the text that I'm thinking of. The church is. The church of the living God is the pillar and ground of the truth. And so when we think of a pillar, we think of something upholding and supporting something. And I think that imagery, that language, probably that Paul was giving to Timothy was being traced maybe all the way back to this idea that the pillar that upheld this temple was God's ability to establish by His power. And the pillar and ground of the truth is the Lord's church in that.
Oh, and from what you just said, you look at this temple, worth in the trillions of dollars of what we've described as we've been reading over the lesson. But the church is made of members, which we are all part of the members of the body of Christ. And each one of us, to God, is more precious than that trillion of dollars that He gave His own Son for us. And we ought to be thankful of what we read in the past to what we got now, that how He blesses each one of us, and the strength as us being members is that He's always with us no matter what's going on around, as long as you're faithful to Him.
Yeah. Piggybacking off of what Steve's saying there, just thinking about the imagery that we have here, this understanding of the temple here, and then we get to the New Testament and Paul talks about, what's your body? It's a temple. Therefore, don't defile it. Can you imagine this precious structure and dragging filth through it on those gold floors? You know, I mean, you would say, no, this is a precious, beautiful, you would not want to desecrate this in any way. And God says, that's what your body is. So don't be involved in sexual immorality, because that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. So that language, this imagery that we're learning here in the Old Testament, the lessons are translated over into the New Testament when that language is used about the Lord's church and Him dwelling with His people, your body being the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so we're developing some images in our mind as we're describing this and talking about this that have application later on. All right, so anything else about the structure itself? You got anything? Anybody else got anything about the temple itself? All right, we kind of got a mental picture of that. Let's move outside the temple now and talk about some of the other things that were formed, because you remember that the tabernacle, it had articles inside the tabernacle, but it also had a couple of articles outside the tabernacle. What were the two articles outside the old tabernacle? The altar of burnt offerings and the bronze laver for the priest to wash in. Okay, well, the temple is going to have corresponding elements outside. And so verse 23, you have a sea. Does anybody have a different word from the word sea in verse 23?
Chapter 6.
7. Chapter 7. What did you say? Tank. Okay, yeah, it's a big holding tank of water. And it's a big holding tank of water. You remember the bronze laver, what was it, like 7 feet across? Something like that? I mean, it was big. But this, it's used. So its circumference is going to be about 45 feet across. It's going to be about 7.5 feet deep in that. I mean, that's a swimming pool. And one calculation that I read, it could hold about 17,500 gallons. That's a pretty good amount. That's a pretty good amount. And so large structure here. And its brim was decorated with ornamental buds circling it all the way around the sea. And it's interesting, its base had 12 oxen. And 3 were facing each direction, north, west, east, and south. And so you had, and they were all facing outward, whichever, so all their tails were to the center, supporting up this large sea or bath there that was to hold water. Now,
Thickness was a handbreadth.
yeah. So what do you think that thing weighed? What do you think it weighed full of water? And so an impressive structure here.
How many gallons you see on water a day?
I read somewhere 17,500.
All you gotta do is multiply it by 8.
Yeah.
1 gallon of water weighs 8 pounds.
So I'm not doing the math right now, but it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. Now, I don't know how this was used. A priest couldn't just say, okay, well, I'm going to wash my hands. It couldn't be used that way. And I'm not sure that it was, because there were other water tanks around the temple. And if you notice, he made 10 carts, verse 27. And these were made of bronze. 4 cubit was the length of its cart, 4 cubit was its width, 3 cubits was its height. In other words, it was about a 6 by 6 by 4.5 structure. And you have these, and you have them on 4 wheels. I suppose that way they could be moved around, but 5 of them were to be on the north side and 5 of them on the south side of the temple. And it seems that these were used for the priest washing. And they would hold about 230 gallons of water. So these seem to be a little bit more practical in the use for the cleaning. And it may have been for washing off the animals that were the pieces of offering that were being offered up and so forth.
The utensils, I was read, that were used for cleaning the utensils as well.
Okay. And so you have these scattered around. Now, what I notice here is the same things are taking place at the temple that took place at the tabernacle. But the tabernacle would be limited. The amount of sacrifices you could be offered at the tabernacle would be limited by the altar, by the bronze laver, by just simply the scale and the size of what was being used. What you have with the temple is you have those things used on a grand scale. So more can take place here. And that would kind of make sense. The nation has grown. The priesthood has grown. And so you would expect that maybe more would be needed there. So that seems to be what's taking place here. It's a big upgrade from the tabernacle. Any thoughts on the sea or the bronze carts? I don't know. I mean, really, this is just a guess, because I'm not sure that I understand exactly how it looked other than these artist renditions. So that may be limiting my understanding of it to begin with. But maybe it was simply to supply the water to these carts. Maybe the carts were on wheels so that they could be rolled over there to be filled and taken back to wherever their station was to be used by the priest. But that is pure speculation. I don't know. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I don't see how it's practically convenient to use that way. But maybe it was to fill up but it doesn't state that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it could have had a valve on it where they pulled the car to fill it up, shut off the valve.
Yeah. All right. So some of the finishings of the temple in the latter part of chapter 7. A lot of things that are mentioned here. We won't go through, and a lot of it we've already covered. But you will notice, like in let's just read verse 48. Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, the table of gold, which was the showbread. All right, so we're not given details. Remember how with the tabernacle we were given the dimensions and the details of that? We're not given details here. We're just told that there were these things. The lampstands, how many lampstands were there in the tabernacle? 1. All right, but here there's a plurality of them. The lampstands were of pure gold, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary, with flowers and the lamps and the wick trimmers of gold. So we have 5 lampstands on each side, a bigger structure, a taller structure, more light needed. You have 10 lampstands as opposed to just 1 in this. Then you have the wick trimmers, the instruments that would be used in this. The basins, the trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, the censers are all of pure gold. Hinges of gold, both for the doors and the inner room. Basically, everything is, all the articles are of gold in this. So no expense has been spared in this, and we wouldn't expect it to be. We knew what the collection was for this.
And those front doors were interesting. We didn't cover that, but they were a bifold style front door. I don't know if that was ahead of its time or what. Pretty creative.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there are some things that I have difficulty picturing. For instance, it talks about the Ark of the Covenant set in the most holy place between the cherubim. And maybe I know I'm getting ahead here, but I'm just trying to think about the structure of this. And it says that the poles for the Ark could be seen from the sanctuary. They couldn't be seen from outside. So if the doors were open and you were standing out here looking in, you could see some of this, but you couldn't see the poles of the Ark. But if you were inside the sanctuary, you could see the poles of the Ark, but it doesn't sound like you could see the Ark itself. I'm not quite sure how that...
Yeah, it doesn't... I don't know. It mentions doors.
Yeah.
And it mentions the veil.
Right.
So I don't know how you would see the poles beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
2 layers of division there.
Yeah. Anything else about the structure? All right, so you have this picture in mind. Pretty impressive. Wow. We're going to build the finest building we possibly can for God because He is Yahweh. And they did so. Now let's drop back, if you will, to chapter 6 again. Go back to chapter 6 to a section that we skipped here, verses 11 through 15. While Solomon is building this, and all of this is taking place, and the beauty of it starts to come to be visible in this. The word of the Lord comes to Solomon saying, concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes and execute my judgments and keep all of my commandments and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David, and I will dwell among you, I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. Okay, so what's the significance of this beautiful building? God will dwell in it. Is God going to dwell in it just because it's a beautiful building? What's the condition that God's going to dwell in it? If they're His people. Okay, so if they walk in His statutes and execute His judgments and keep all of His commandments, to walk in them. That's the condition. The children of Israel forgot that along the way. When this is being built, even as this magnificent structure is going up and people are oohing and awing and saying, wow, boy, the bronze pillars passed by our house today. Did you see those things? That's unbelievable. And what God says is, wait a minute, don't lose sight that my dwelling in this house and being among you is not contingent upon you building the most magnificent building. It's about you walking in my statutes and my judgments and being faithful to me. We get to Jeremiah's day. And the Babylonians are coming. And Jeremiah is saying, we might as well give up to the Babylonians. We might as well surrender. And everybody says, what are you, a traitor? And he said, I'm telling you, God's going to give us over to the Babylonians because we've not walked in His ways and kept His statutes. And all the other false prophets are saying, peace, peace, peace. We have the temple. God's not going to let anything happen to the temple. We've got this great structure that Solomon built to our God. There's no way God would let Jerusalem fall. Peace, peace. What happened? That's right. God said, no, that beautiful building, all of that gold can be carried to Babylon. That's fine. That's fine. You have not been my people. You have not walked in my statutes. Having a beautiful building dedicated to my name does nothing if you're not loyal to me and you're not faithful to me. And they'd forgotten that. But God had told them right at the beginning, that's what it's going to take for me to dwell here and to be among you. And for this building to have any spiritual significance, it'll be because you are faithful and loyal. And that principle, however you want to apply it, is still applicable today. That if we're going to be His people, Larson's talking about the church, we can call ourselves a church of Christ. But we're not really a church of Christ unless we follow Christ. Not just call Him Lord, but do the things that He says. And so that same concept is always been true.
You know, it's interesting how many times the Lord repeats that phrase to Solomon. Of course, when God first revealed, His plans to David, He told David the same thing regarding Solomon and generations after Solomon. But David, I don't recall him ever speaking to David, as far as, if you will remain faithful. But it's Solomon that it's time and time again. David multiple times says the same thing to Solomon, from the Lord. And then the Lord Himself says it multiple times again, just to try to reinforce that idea.
Yeah.
It seems that God knew He would.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to remain steadfast.
Think about David and Solomon and God telling them this over and over. It's not the first time the Israelites heard this say. When Moses come down from the mountain, he told them the same thing. We had to go back up, bring down more stones, told them the same thing. When they was wandering through the wilderness, he told them the same thing. When Joshua come along, the people were told again, you must follow the commandments. And when they went to the two mountains and the law was read, and they says, I agree, we will do. It was the blessings and the cursings of the same things that are mentioned to Solomon. So if the Levi was doing what they were supposed to be doing, teaching the people, even through David and Solomon's time, this should be indwelled in all the people's minds that not only Solomon heard it, but all the people of the nation heard it. And when they fall away, it wasn't because of just Solomon's mistreatment. They should have still followed it, even though if their king didn't.
Yeah. And by the way, we're talking about that message being repeated over and over. Read the Gospels. Read the letters to the Christians, the epistles. What do we see there to us? That same message repeated over and over again in that. And by the way, talking about in Jeremiah's day, them having a hard time grasping that God could let something happen to the temple. What happened to the tabernacle at Shiloh? It seems like the Philistines probably captured it. We're not given the details about that, but later on, one of the prophets says, hey, before you go trusting in the temple, you just remember what happened to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. We know that God allowed His ark to be captured by the Philistines. We saw that. That wasn't a good luck charm that was just, magically protect them in some ways. And so we've already seen that, and we see that here as well. All right, anything else before we get into moving in?
I just say one thing. Last week we talked about the hopes of Solomon and what, if you were a member of the kingdom, what that would look like. Well, this was a key part of that promise. David had asked to build a house. No, your son will build my house. Now, obviously, he's ultimately pointing to what Jesus is going to build when he's talking about the real house, His people. But I think people watching this happen would say, this is it. And I really think that I know they have been in the land and they've settled the land, but there's almost a sense in which the building of the temple is like the completion of this long Exodus wandering settlement period. Because it's interesting, at the beginning of the chapter, he says, 480 years ago they came out of Egypt. Well, why bring that up? I think the temple was like the sign that they were established in the land, because Deuteronomy was saying, there's coming a day where you'll get in the land and I'll build you a house, and you'll build a house. So I think that this would have been like an exclamation point on God's fulfillment of His promises.
Yeah.
Here He is dwelling among them. And so we talked about last week, and Alan and I talked about it last night, thinking about if you're looking at Solomon, he's David's son, he's on the throne, he's built now the house that God promised, so your expectations would be really high. So I'm just previewing just a little bit, thinking about how it falls apart. And so, well, there's got to be something else. But, the people will get a taste of that along the way.
Yes.
Like Josiah will be a preview of it, of rebuilding the house. Maybe this is him, and other righteous kings along the way, but ultimately all pointing to Jesus.
But you're right. This probably, I would say the closest we ever get to the literal fulfillment of, I know those promises were literally fulfilled, but what I'm saying, in their mind, this idea of living in a land flowing with milk and honey,
in a physical way.
In a physical way, this is close.
I do think the promises in 2 Samuel were both about David's sons who were not
Yes.
Jesus, but ultimately pointing to Jesus. I think it's kind of like a greater than symbol. It's getting better and better the way it's being fulfilled all along the way.
That's right.
Zerubbabel will be another fulfillment of this, in that he helps the rebuilding of the temple when they come back.
Yeah.
But what God is doing is He's giving previews all along the way.
Yes.
And then ultimately, the temple, it won't be a building. It won't just be our physical bodies. It'll be us in His presence.
That's right.
The temple. There really won't be a temple.
Yes.
Fulfilled in that.
That's right.
It just the picture keeps getting better.
So I appreciate you bringing this up, because we don't want to lose sight of, where did we start in Genesis? A seed. A seed is coming. The serpent slayer is coming. Is this it? Is this the grand thing? And then we see it fall apart and we go, oh, no, it's not. It can't be. We were looking for something else. And so, yeah, good thoughts there. No, go ahead. You can finish.
I would just say that even when you connect it to the garden, all of the flowery imagery and this dwelling of God, I don't know that we're not reconnecting to the Garden of Eden in some sense. Whereas this can be a place where God's presence, where people who listen to His rules, it kind of radiates out from there. Maybe this is kind of a throwback to that image that's supposed to make people long for really dwelling with God.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of forget that the symbol is not the real thing.
Yeah.
And so we experience that in a greater way. Maybe it doesn't feel like a greater way because we don't have a temple we can go touch, but it is a greater way because He's with all of us, each individually, and then we're longing for the greatest fulfillment of it all.
Yeah. Dwight?
Don't you know that Solomon felt the weight of this on his shoulders? God was speaking to Solomon and saying, if you follow my ways and keep my commandments, then I'll bless you and your people. David, back in chapter 2, was speaking to his son Solomon and said, you've got to walk and keep God's commandments yourself. And if he did that, then God would bless them all.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Let's start in chapter 8 anyway. So Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes and the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is in Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled with King Solomon at the feast of the month of Ethnim, which is in the 7th month, and all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took the ark, and they brought the ark of the Lord, the tabernacle of meeting, and all of the holy furnishings that were in the tabernacle. The priests and the Levites brought them. Also King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel were assembled to him, were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep, oxen, how many? So many it couldn't even be numbered. In other words, no expense is being spared. Everything that can be done is being done. They're doing the max they can in trying to honor the Lord here. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. And dropping down, and here's where I talked about in verse 8, the poles extended so that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And it says in verse 9, interesting note, what was in the ark? Yeah, and it says there was nothing, at least the King James says there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses had put there at Mount Horeb. What used to be in there? And the pot of manna. And so something's happened to those. They're no longer in there, but the 2 tables of stone are still in there at this point. And so it says that God made a covenant. Drop down to verse 10. And it came to pass when the priest came out of the holy place that a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not continue ministering because of the cloud. And the glory of the Lord, or for the glory of the Lord, filled the house of the Lord. When was the last time we saw that happen?
Tabernacle.
In the tabernacle. That's exactly right. And that was a sign that God dwelt there, that His presence was there. And now we have that again. And so, powerful moment. I mean, a powerful moment. Nothing like this has been seen since the days of the wanderings in the wilderness. And so, what an impressive moment. And Solomon spoke, the Lord said He would dwell in a dark cloud, but I have surely built a house, an exalted house, and a place for you to dwell forever. Now, Solomon recognizes that this is not the literal place that God dwells or that God's limited to. But what he recognizes, what God has shown here, is that I will be with my people. And He showed that in the physical presence of coming in and filling the temple with the cloud of His presence and His glory. And so, magnificent time. I mean, magnificent time in Israel right now. And it's amazing. Any final thoughts? You got anything? I hogged all that.
It would be spectacular to see that confirmation that God was accepting this work. I mean,
One thing,
how could words describe that moment
Yeah.
at that time?
one thing that when the cloud, the glory of the Lord's there, we as humans take it that, well, that's the only place God was at, because it says that His presence was there. God is all through the universe, and He's just showing us and them at that time that He was also there too.
Yeah.
But He was throughout, everywhere.
Yep. Thank y'all. Appreciate your good attention.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.